My name is Margaret Keaton. I am 68 years old, a white woman born and raised in a small coastal town where the ocean air seeps into your bones and never leaves. I have spent most of my life as a school librarian, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the quiet discipline of order, and for the past 45 years, I have been the wife of Jack Keaton, a man who once made me believe in the kind of steady love that lasts a lifetime. This morning, as I stand in the arched doorway of St. Mark's Church, the air is damp and heavy, clinging to my skin as if it wants to weigh me down into the grief I have been holding back since the night they called to tell me Jack was gone. The smell of lilies drapes over the space like a shroud, too sweet, almost suffocating, and somewhere beneath it, I catch the faint scent of rain-soaked coats as mourners file in, murmuring condolences they have rehearsed in their cars on the way here. The casket at the front is closed, polished mahogany catching the light from the stained glass windows, a silent sentinel to the life it holds. I keep my gaze fixed on it, not because I want to, but because I do not trust my eyes to roam without betraying me. Yet even as I stand rooted in my place, accepting the touch of hands on my arm, my attention strays to the back pews where a small cluster of strangers sits. They are dressed properly for the occasion, dark suits and modest dresses, but there is something in the way they lean together, something in the glistening eyes of one woman in particular, that feels too personal, too deeply cut into whatever grief they carry. I do not know them, yet they seem to know me, or at least know of me, and that knowledge presses like a pebble in my shoe, impossible to ignore no matter how I try. The organ swells, and the first hymn begins, voices rising around me like a tide, but mine does not join them. My throat is too tight. My hands twist together in my lap, fingers cold despite the heat from the nearby radiator. I tell myself that funerals bring out all kinds, that people come to pay respects for reasons I will never know. But as the woman in the back lifts her head, her eyes catch mine. The look she gives me is not curiosity, and it is not pity. It is something sharper, something with edges, and it cuts straight through the haze of loss to a place in me that starts to tremble. I look away, forcing myself to follow the thread of the minister's voice, but I can still feel her gaze on me, steady, unblinking, as though she has been waiting for this moment, as though she has been waiting for me. The line of mourners moved with the slow, uneven rhythm of waves retreating from a shore, each person pausing before me with the same muted expression, the same murmured words that brushed against my ears and dissolved into the thick air of the church hall. I kept my eyes lowered to their hands more than their faces, watching the small gestures of sympathy, the way fingers tightened briefly over mine before letting go, as if releasing something fragile they dared not keep. It was in that procession that she appeared, a woman I had never seen before, her hair the colour of chestnuts and her coat damp at the hem, holding the hand of a boy who could not have been more than 8. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and he clung to her with the instinctive trust children give without thought. She smiled faintly, but her lips trembled, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that did not sound like the ordinary strain of grief. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, her eyes steady on mine. And then, so low I almost thought I had imagined it, she added 2 words that hollowed the air around me. "Our Jack." The syllables slid between us like a blade, quiet and sure. And for a moment I felt as if I had stepped outside myself, as though the room and its dim hum of conversation had receded, leaving only the echo of that claim. My grip on her hand loosened without my meaning it to, but she held on for the briefest beat longer, her gaze not breaking, and then she moved on, guiding the boy toward the far exit as if she had only come to deliver that message, and nothing else. My heart beat unevenly, a strange mixture of disbelief and a dawning chill that crept into my fingers, up my arms, into my chest, where it settled heavily beside my grief. I wanted to call her back, to ask what she meant, to demand clarity from the curve of her lips that had shaped those words. But my sister's hand touched my elbow, urging me toward the side room where she said I could rest a moment. "You need to sit," she murmured, her voice practical, protective, and I let her steer me a few steps before I turned to look for the woman. She was gone. The doorway she had passed through now framed only the outline of a man stacking empty coffee cups, his head bent to the task. The boy's small hand, the glint of chestnut hair, the weight of those 2 words, all of it had vanished into the ordinary murmur of the funeral's ebb and flow. My sister spoke again, asking if I needed water, but I barely heard her. I was listening instead to the quiet place in my mind, where that voice still lingered, replaying its claim as if to test my resolve to ignore it, whispering it over and over until I could no longer be certain I wanted it to stop. The wind at the graveside carried the dampness of freshly turned earth, curling through the folds of my black coat and settling in my bones as if it meant to stay there. I stood near the head of the casket, my gloved hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the polished wood that reflected the muted grey of the winter sky. Around me, the murmurs of the gathered blurred into a single low note, rising and falling with the sigh of the wind. That was when I saw them, just off to the side where the spray of roses from our children had been placed with care. White lilies, their petals impossibly pure against the dark soil, lay in an elegant cascade that looked almost too perfect for the rough honesty of a grave. Their scent drifted toward me, heavier than the lilies inside the church, and with it came an unease I could not explain until I leaned closer and saw the card tucked discreetly among the stems. The handwriting was delicate yet deliberate, looping in a way that spoke of someone who took time with their words. 2 simple ones were written there, a whisper inked in black. "Forever yours." I stared at them, the letters seeming to curl and sway in the wind, and my stomach tightened as if bracing for a blow. It was not my handwriting, nor that of any family member I knew. There were no initials, no signature, no clue beyond the feminine curve of the letters. I slipped the card from the stems, the motion small and unnoticed by the others, who had gathered in their clusters of quiet conversation. The paper felt warm in my palm, though I knew that was only the heat of my own hand seeping into it. I thought of the woman from the church hall, the one with the chestnut hair and the boy's small, trusting hand in hers, and the way her eyes had met mine without flinching. My heart beat a little faster, as if the flowers themselves were a message meant to follow the words she had left behind. I glanced around, scanning faces, but saw only neighbours, distant relatives, and the occasional unfamiliar mourner whose grief was painted on like a borrowed coat. The ground seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet, the knowledge pressing in that this grave did not only hold the husband I had known, but the secrets he had kept buried from me. The minister's voice rose, solemn and steady, calling us to prayer, and I slipped the card into the pocket of my coat. It pressed against my hip as we bowed our heads, a silent weight that would not be prayed away. As the final blessing was spoken and the casket was lowered inch by inch, my eyes returned to the lilies, their white faces turned upward, as if they were not watching a man descend into the earth, but waiting for something else entirely, something that was still to come. The evening light through the church hall windows had taken on that tired amber cast that makes every shadow seem longer, every sound a little more hollow, as if the day itself were ready to fold in on itself and be done. I stood near the memorial table, a place I had arranged with care that morning, draped in white linen and holding photographs of Jack from the life I had known. Jack in his fishing hat, Jack at our daughter's wedding, Jack carving the Thanksgiving turkey with flour on his cheek from some ill-fated kitchen experiment. People came and went in a quiet rhythm, pressing my hand, murmuring their kind but rehearsed words, then moving along to sip weak coffee from paper cups. That was when I saw her again, the woman whose presence had unsettled me like a draught through a closed room. She walked with a certain gravity, as though the floor beneath her recognized her steps. Beside her was a girl on the cusp of adulthood, long-limbed and poised in the awkward grace of 17 or 18, her hair pulled back to reveal eyes that stopped me mid-breath. They were Jack's eyes, that unmistakable shade of clear grey-blue that had caught the sunlight in our kitchen on so many mornings, eyes that had squinted at me in laughter, eyes that now looked out from a face I had never seen before. The girl avoided my gaze, her attention fixed on the table, as the woman reached into a large handbag and pulled out a framed photograph. She placed it among the others without hesitation, as if she had every right, as if the space had been waiting for her contribution. I stared at it before I could stop myself. Jack stood there in the picture, arm wrapped snugly around her waist. The same easy smile he had given me in the early years of our marriage spread across his face. On his other side, the young girl leaned in close, and at her feet, the boy I had seen earlier rested a hand on Jack's knee, his grin wide and certain. The image radiated warmth and belonging, the kind of portrait people take to send in Christmas cards, to hang above mantles, to remind themselves that they are each other's world. My heart thudded in a slow, heavy beat, as I realized this was not a stolen snapshot, but a family picture, carefully taken, chosen, and framed. She adjusted its position slightly, ensuring it faced outward, then looked at me with a softness that did not reach her eyes. I could not move, could not speak, as the hum of the hall carried on around us, oblivious to the way the ground had just shifted beneath my feet. The photograph stayed there, mingling with the artifacts of my life with Jack, as if daring me to say which ones belonged and which ones did not. I felt the air around me change, as if the hum of voices and clink of coffee cups had been muffled under a heavy cloth, and before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped away from the small knot of neighbours, offering polite condolences, and crossed the room toward her. She stood near the end of the memorial table, the photograph she had placed there, glowing faintly under the overhead light, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, while the girl lingered just behind, eyes cast down. My shoes tapped against the polished floor, each step sounding louder to me than it should have, and when I stopped in front of her, the smell of her perfume, something soft and floral, drifted up to meet me. I asked her name, my voice low but steady, and she met my gaze with an expression that was neither hostile nor apologetic, just unnervingly calm. "I'm his wife too," she said, the words falling between us like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples I could almost feel on my skin. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, that perhaps the day's grief had finally begun to twist the edges of reality. But she went on, her voice quiet enough to force me to lean closer. She told me they had never been married in the legal sense, but had lived as husband and wife for more than 15 years, raising the boy and the girl together, building a life in another corner of the world I had never been invited to see. "They're his children," she added, and the words struck harder than I expected, not because I doubted them, but because I could see Jack's features etched so plainly in both their faces that denial would have been absurd. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief, not acceptance, but the slackening of a rope that had been holding me upright all day. Around us, the murmurs of conversation faltered, and I realized too late that others had begun to notice. People edged closer, not openly, but in the way curious onlookers do, their bodies angling just slightly toward the scene, their ears pricked for every syllable. My sister appeared at my side, her hand hovering near my elbow as though ready to pull me away, but I could not move. The woman's gaze didn't waver, even as the space around us filled with the subtle static of overheard scandal. Somewhere behind me, a spoon clinked hard against a saucer, a sharp, accidental punctuation to a moment that felt both intimate and public. My mouth was dry, my heart beating with a slow, deliberate force, and all I could think was that the story of my marriage had just split in two, the fault line running straight through this room, through this day, through me. I could feel the walls of the church hall pressing in, the mingled scents of coffee, flowers, and too many bodies making the air thick and difficult to draw into my lungs. And before anyone could stop me, I turned away from the clusters of murmuring mourners and walked straight for the door. My steps felt clumsy, as though my shoes were filled with stones. But I kept going, my eyes fixed on the strip of cold light spilling through the doorway from the outside. I heard my sister calling after me, her voice soft but urgent, and then her heels tapping across the floor as she followed. Outside, the late afternoon air hit me like a douse of cold water, startling and sharp, clearing my head just enough for the ache in my chest to sharpen into something almost unbearable. I walked quickly toward her car, not looking back, not giving myself the chance to be pulled into another conversation that would drain what little strength I had left. Once we were inside, the door closing with a dull thud, she asked if I was all right, though I think we both knew the answer. I told her I just needed to go home, and she didn't press me, only started the engine and pulled us onto the quiet street, the tires crunching over grit in a steady rhythm that was somehow both soothing and maddening. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing houses, their windows glowing in the dim light, each one holding lives I knew nothing about. And all the while, the image of the girl's eyes stayed with me. That shade of clear, pale blue that seemed almost grey in certain light, framed by lashes that caught the sun in a way I had seen every morning for decades across my own kitchen table. It was Jack's gaze, Jack's quiet intensity, but set in a face that was not mine, a face I had never been allowed to know, and the realization kept turning over in my mind like a coin I couldn't stop flipping. My sister reached over at one point and rested her hand briefly on mine, the pressure gentle, steady, but I could feel the question she wasn't asking. How many people knew? The thought rose unbidden and stayed there, heavy and insistent. Had his friends at work known? Neighbours? Relatives who had smiled at me across holiday tables? Had they all kept this secret, as if it were their own, sparing me the truth not out of kindness, but out of loyalty to him? The possibility made my throat ache in a way grief alone could not. As we turned into my street, the familiar sight of my own front porch should have comforted me, but instead it felt foreign, as if I were returning to a house that no longer belonged entirely to me. The house was too quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that does not soothe but sharpens, making every small sound stand out like a pin dropped onto glass. My sister had insisted on staying, but I told her I needed to be alone, and after a long, searching look, she kissed my cheek and left without another word. I hung my coat on the hook in the hallway, but my hands would not stay still, fidgeting against the fabric, clenching and unclenching as though they were trying to find something to hold on to. I drifted into the bedroom, the air faintly scented with Jack's cologne, and the sight of his neatly hung suits and folded sweaters made my chest ache. I told myself I was only going to sort through his things to keep my mind occupied, but as I began checking the pockets of his coats and the compartments of his briefcase, I knew there was another reason, one I did not want to name yet. It was in the lining of his navy wool overcoat that my fingers found a small, uneven bulge. The seam had been restitched by hand, but not with my stitches, and I eased it open carefully, the thread snapping softly under my nails until a narrow gap appeared. Inside was a slim black phone, the kind you buy without a contract, unremarkable in every way, except for the fact that I had never seen it before. My pulse quickened as I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the power button, the screen lighting up to reveal a lock screen photograph of the boy I had seen at the funeral, his grin wide and confident, his arm draped around the shoulders of the girl with Jack's eyes. The phone was not locked, and with a small, deliberate breath, I opened the gallery. The first image was of Jack, smiling on a sunlit beach, his arm looped around the waist of the woman with chestnut hair, their faces lit with the easy warmth of people at home in each other's company. The next was of a Christmas morning scene, wrapping paper scattered around the boy and girl as they held up their gifts. Jack crouched behind them in a sweater I had never seen, grinning as if the moment were his alone to treasure. There were birthdays with cake candles glowing, vacations in mountains and cities I had never visited, picnics in parks where his hand rested lightly on her knee, all neatly catalogued in the months and years I had thought he was away on business. The photographs blurred as tears filled my eyes, but they were not the hot tears of fresh grief. They were heavier, darker, as something inside me shifted and my sorrow began to coil into something far less forgiving. My grief, so raw only hours ago, was curdling, thickening into rage that settled deep in my chest like a stone I could not lift. I chose a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where the hiss of the espresso machine and the quiet clink of cups could act as a buffer against the weight of the conversation I knew was coming. I sat by the window, watching the street outside where early winter rain had turned the pavement slick and reflective, and every few seconds I glanced toward the door, unsure whether I was hoping she would come or praying she would not. When she arrived, it was without hesitation, her posture straight, her coat buttoned neatly to the throat, her expression calm in a way that felt deliberate. She spotted me immediately and crossed the room with steady steps, sliding into the chair opposite mine without waiting for an invitation. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, the air between us taut with all the things we had not yet said. I began by asking why she had placed that photograph on the memorial table, why she had come to the funeral at all. Her gaze did not waver, and her voice was low but clear as she told me she had known about me for years. She said Jack had explained our marriage as an arrangement, a hollow shell kept intact for appearances, a life that had long since gone cold. He had told her that love no longer lived in our house, that we shared walls and a name, but not the intimacy or warmth of real partners. I felt those words land inside me with a dull, heavy thud, not because I believed them, but because I recognized the precision with which they had been chosen, the way they were designed to protect him and justify her place in his life. The anger I had been carrying since the funeral shifted, losing its heat, settling into something colder and more dangerous, like a river that freezes over but still moves with force beneath the ice. I asked her if she had ever thought to question him, to wonder if his version of me was a distortion meant to keep us apart. But she only sipped her coffee and said that when you love someone, you want to believe what they tell you. Outside, a bus passed, its headlights flashing briefly across her face, And I saw then that she was not as untouched by this as she wanted me to think. There were fine lines of strain at the corners of her mouth, a faint tightening around her eyes. We sat in silence for a while, the muted chatter of the cafe filling the spaces between us, and I realized we were two women who had been living on opposite sides of the same lie, each made smaller by it in ways we might never fully name. When she finally stood to leave, she gave me a polite nod, as though we had concluded a business transaction, and walked out into the rain without looking back. When she first mentioned that the children should be present for the reading of the will, I thought I had misheard her, but the steady way she looked at me told me I had not. We were sitting in that same cafe, a week after our first meeting, the air heavy with the scent of roasted coffee and damp wool from the coats draped over the backs of chairs. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing a logistical detail rather than a revelation that scraped raw a part of me I had not yet touched. She explained that they deserved to hear what was left to them, that Jack had been careful to ensure they would be provided for. I listened, my hands curled around my cup for warmth I could not seem to draw into my body, until she said, almost as an afterthought, that they did not know much about me beyond the fact that I had been their father's friend. The word landed with a strange hollowness, as though it had fallen down a deep well inside me. Friend. Not wife, not stepmother, not even someone of significance, but a neutral placeholder that stripped away decades of my life and the vows I had once believed unbreakable. I thought of the boy's eager smile in that photograph, of the girl's wary eyes that mirrored Jack's so precisely, and for a moment my fury gave way to something far more painful. They had been born into the shadows of his choices, made to carry a version of the truth crafted to protect him, and my anger at her and at Jack twisted into an ache for them. It was the kind of ache that pressed hard behind the ribs, making it difficult to breathe evenly. I wondered if they had ever asked about me, if they had been told stories meant to reassure them, or ones meant to erase me entirely. The unfairness of it curled in my stomach, but alongside it grew the quiet, stubborn certainty that none of this was their fault. They were as much victims of his deception as I was, caught in the slipstream of his double life without the tools to see it for what it was. As she spoke on about dates and arrangements, I let my gaze drift to the rain-speckled window, the world outside moving past, as if indifferent to the fact that in here, two women were deciding how two young lives would be invited into a truth neither had asked for. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I would not have them there. But instead I found myself nodding faintly, thinking that perhaps they deserved to hear at least part of what their father had left behind, even if the rest of the story would remain locked in the silent spaces between us. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old leather and something metallic, like the lingering tang of coins counted too many times, and as I sat in the stiff-backed chair across from his desk, I felt the air between the four of us grow dense enough to touch. She sat to my left, the boy and girl on either side of her, their postures mirroring each other in a way that made my chest ache, even as I tried not to look directly at them. The lawyer, a thin man with silver hair and the deliberate movements of someone who has spent a lifetime sifting through the messes left by the dead, cleared his throat and opened a folder thick with documents. His voice was calm, professional, but each word seemed to cut cleanly into the air as he began to read Jack's will. I listened as he spoke of assets I recognized, the house, the car, the small savings account we had built together, and then, without pause, he listed bank accounts I had never heard of, accounts in her name and in the names of the children, each with balances that made my breath catch. He moved on to other holdings, property in another town, investments carefully tucked away, all divided with a precision that felt surgical, each portion balanced between us as though Jack had been splitting a pie no one had agreed to share. My hands rested in my lap, fingers interlaced so tightly my knuckles ached, and I could feel her eyes flick toward me once, quick and unreadable, before returning to the lawyer. The children sat quietly, the boy fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket, the girl staring down at her folded hands, and I wondered if they understood the weight of what they were being given, or if they would only understand years from now, when they realized what it had cost. The lawyer's expression never shifted from its neutral mask, but there was a flicker, a brief narrowing of the eyes, when he looked up between paragraphs, the kind of look that said he had seen this before, two versions of a life meeting in the same room for the first time, but rarely in a room so taut with silence. I could feel my pulse in my throat, steady but heavy, and with each new line he read, the image of the man I had buried grew sharper and more fractured. When he finally closed the folder, the sound of paper sliding against paper seemed louder than it should have been. He asked if there were any questions, but none of us spoke. The truth had been laid out in neat legal language, each page a mirror reflecting a man who had managed to keep two worlds balanced until death forced them to collide. I left the office with the taste of copper in my mouth, as if I had bitten down on something hard, and the knowledge that his life had been split cleanly in two, right down the middle, and I had never even seen the line. It did not take long for the story to travel, slipping through the narrow streets and tidy hedged yards of our town the way a cold wind finds the smallest cracks in a house, curling into every corner until it cannot be ignored. At first it was subtle, the shift in the way people greeted me at the market, or paused just a beat too long when I walked into the post office. But soon it became unmistakable. Neighbours I had shared cups of sugar with, whose children I had watched grow from toddlers into parents themselves, now looked at me with an almost hungry curiosity, their eyes skimming over me as though trying to match the image they had known for decades with the one they had heard about over dinner tables and in whispered phone calls. It was not pity that lived in those glances, but something more invasive, the intrigue of a soap opera that had inexplicably come to life on their own street. A few were bold enough to speak of it openly, leaning in as if confessing something, admitting they had seen Jack in the city with her, sometimes with the children, and had assumed it was a work thing, a charitable event, or simply none of their business. I listened without expression, the words landing with the dull thud of confirmation, each account another thread in a tapestry I had not asked to see, but could no longer look away from. Others avoided me entirely, crossing to the other side of the street or pretending not to notice me in the aisles of the grocery store, as if my presence might pull them into the orbit of something too messy to touch. The isolation that had begun as a quiet space I thought I needed started to feel more like a widening gulf, a place I was being pushed into and left to occupy alone. Even the familiar rhythms of the town seemed altered. The morning walk to the bakery for bread felt longer, the faces behind the counter more guarded, the laughter from cafe tables carrying an undertone I could not quite name. At night, when the house was still, and the only sound was the tick of the kitchen clock, I thought about how quickly a life could be reframed by the people around you, how in a matter of days I had gone from the reliable widow of a respected man to the unwilling lead in a story they would tell and retell until it became something unrecognizable. I wondered if Jack had ever imagined this aftermath, if he had pictured the way his two worlds would collide and scatter debris across the quiet streets we had once walked together. In the dark, I could almost hear the murmur of voices carrying my name, and each time it left me with the same cold, hollow sensation, as if the walls of this town had drawn back just enough to let me see I was no longer truly part of it. When I first told my children, their faces tightened in the same way they had when they were little, and I had to break news that would disappoint them. But this time, there was no gentle explanation, no way to soften the edges. They shook their heads, almost in unison, as if my words were too implausible to belong in the same reality as the man they had called their father. My son leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter, while my daughter's eyes filled with the kind of tears she did not want to let fall. They asked if I was sure, if perhaps I had misunderstood, if grief was clouding my judgment. I said nothing, only slid the phone across the table, its screen already lit with the gallery open. The photograph spoke in a language that required no translation. Jack on a beach, with the woman's hand resting lightly in his. Jack blowing out birthday candles with a boy whose grin mirrored his own. Jack with his arms slung around the girl whose eyes matched his, so exactly it hurt to look at her. I watched the change come over them, disbelief giving way to something sharper, a tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. My son scrolled through slowly, as if forcing himself to take in every frame, while my daughter pushed the phone away after only a handful, her hands trembling in her lap. We sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Then came the questions, halting at first, then spilling faster. When had it started? How long had I known? Why had I never suspected? I told them I did not have answers that would make sense. But together we began turning over the past like a puzzle we had never realized was missing pieces. The business trips that always seemed to fall over school breaks, the unexplained withdrawals that Jack would brush off as covering a work thing. The nights he came home later than he promised, without the faintest trace of where he had been lingering on his clothes. Even the absences during family milestones began to take on a new shape. The sudden illnesses, the urgent meetings, all of it rearranging itself into a timeline that pointed toward a truth none of us wanted to see. My daughter eventually asked if we had been nothing more than a performance for him, and though I told her I did not believe that, the words felt thin in my mouth. By the end of the night, we were quieter, each of us lost in our own recalibration of the man we had loved, knowing that the rift this left in our family was not one time would easily mend. The hall was already warm with the press of bodies when I arrived, the air humming with polite conversation and the clinking of glassware, the kind of atmosphere Jack had always thrived in. This fundraiser had been his idea months before he died, a cause tied to some community project he believed in, and I had debated whether to come at all. Knowing she would be here, knowing the memory of him in this room would not be the one I had carried for most of our life together. I saw her almost immediately, standing near the far table with the girl and boy beside her, her dress a shade of deep green that caught the light when she moved. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but pushed it aside as I made my way to the front, where a microphone waited. The crowd quieted as I stepped up, their attention turning toward me with a mix of expectation and curiosity, the kind that makes the skin at the back of your neck prickle. I began by thanking them for coming, for supporting something Jack had cared about, and then I let the words shift, slow and deliberate, into the territory I had been holding in my mouth for days. I spoke of truth, of how easy it is to believe we know someone completely, how comforting it is to let the surface convince us there is nothing more beneath. I spoke of betrayal, the kind that grows quietly in the dark, until one day it steps into the light and you cannot look away. I did not name her, did not need to, because as my voice carried through the hall, I could see heads turning, eyes flicking toward where she stood, their glances quick but unmistakable. I told them about the hidden lives we sometimes discover only when it is too late to confront the one who kept them, about the strange and cruel gift of clarity that arrives when you can no longer demand explanations. My voice did not tremble, though I could feel the weight of every syllable in my chest, and the silence in the room had a density to it, as if the air itself had thickened. She did not move, her chin lifted slightly, her expression unreadable. But the children looked down at the floor, their bodies angled in toward each other like two trees leaning together against the wind. When I finished, I thanked the crowd again, stepped away from the microphone, and the applause that followed was polite, measured, as though they were unsure if clapping was the right response. As I walked back through the room, I felt the eyes on me, on her, on the invisible thread stretched taut between us. And I knew that whatever story they carried home tonight would be told in lowered voices, as if speaking it too loudly might make it real. The crowd had thinned by the time I found her again, the noise of the fundraiser fading into the clatter of staff clearing tables and the low hum of a vacuum in a distant corner. She stood near the exit, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, while the girl wandered a few steps away, running her fingers along the spines of books in a display case, as if searching for something to distract her. I walked toward her with a calm that felt unnatural, the kind that comes when every word has already been chosen and there is nothing left to rehearse. She turned as I stopped in front of her, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile, just patient, as though she had been expecting this moment since the day of the funeral. I told her plainly that I would not contest what Jack had left to her children, that I would not drag them into a fight they had never asked for. Her eyes flickered with something, relief maybe, but before it could settle, I went on, telling her I would not pretend she had been an innocent bystander in all of this. She met my gaze without flinching, her voice quiet but steady, as she said she had stayed because he gave her security, that she had known parts of the truth and chosen to live with the rest because the life he offered was one she was not willing to give up. There was no apology in her tone, and I realized I had not come looking for one. The truth, bare and unadorned, was all I had wanted, and now it was here between us like a stone neither of us could move. For a moment, we stood in silence, the boy shifting his weight from foot to foot, the girl glancing over with a faint crease in her brow, sensing something unspoken. I told her this would be the last time we spoke of him, that whatever we each carried from here on would be ours alone to bear. She nodded once, the motion small, almost imperceptible, and extended her hand. I took it briefly, the touch cool and without warmth, a gesture that felt less like reconciliation than the sealing of an agreement. When we let go, she gathered the children, guiding them toward the door without looking back. I watched them leave, the green of her dress catching the light for an instant before the night swallowed them. The hall seemed emptier than it had moments ago, as if some final piece of this had been lifted away, leaving only the echo of our conversation and the quiet understanding that whatever connection Jack had forged between us was now severed. It was not peace, not in the way I once understood it, but it was an ending, and in that cold finality there was a kind of closure I had not thought I would find. If you have read this far, then you have walked with me through a story I never wanted to tell, one that unstitched the seams of the life I thought I knew, and forced me to see what had been hidden in plain sight. Betrayal is not only the breaking of trust between two people, it is the slow corrosion of faith in your own judgment, the unsettling realization that you lived beside someone for decades without truly knowing the map of their heart. It teaches you how easy it is to mistake familiarity for truth, How easily the mind smooths over the small irregularities, because it is easier to believe in the comfort of the life you have than to face the chaos of what might be real. I have learned that grief and anger are not opposing forces. They can inhabit the same space, intertwining like the roots of two trees that grow together underground, each drawing from the same soil, yet reaching in different directions. There are mornings I still miss the version of Jack I thought I had, and there are nights when the memory of his deceptions burns so hot in my chest I cannot sleep. Both are real, both are mine, and I have stopped trying to choose between them. The truth, however late it arrives, is still a truth, and it demands to be spoken, even if your voice trembles, and even if it changes the way the world looks at you. I have learned that silence is not always noble. Sometimes it is the accomplice that lets the lie live longer than it should. For years, I did not question the absences, the small inconsistencies, the way certain questions were met with a quick smile and a change of subject. I told myself I was being trusting, that love meant giving space, but now I see that my quiet allowed a parallel life to flourish in the shadows. So I speak now, to you, to myself, to anyone who might be standing in the doorway of a truth they do not want to see. Speak before the silence swallows you. Ask the questions that feel dangerous. Pull at the threads, even if you fear the whole cloth will come apart. There is a cost to knowing, but there is a greater cost to living in the dark. I do not know what shape my life will take from here, only that it will not be built on unasked questions and unanswered doubts. I promise myself, and I promise you, that silence will never again be my role, because I have lived the damage it can do, and I will not give it that power over me twice.